to speak, you'll.
So Rabbi, you need to unmute.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, welcome. So, moment of visual access here. I am Rabbi Julie White, 65-year-old human being with the map of the world behind me. Warm. It's a little bit cold compared to Florida where Ruth is. We just heard it's in the 80s. It's a little cold here, but it's a beautiful sunny day. And I see over 25 people in this Zoom room, with more coming in at every moment, several panels of pages. Really glad to see everybody. We are continuing with our Judaism as an Evolving Civilization series. This is part 3, our final part. And I'm going to, after we do our Torah learning prayer, our immersing ourselves in Torah prayer, I will open with a question for you all. But let us start with Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you for the inspiration to immerse ourselves in learning. Amen. I want to start by asking if anybody has comments or reflections either on this week's reading or just on what's happened so far in the first 2 sessions that we've been through together on Judaism as an Evolving Civilization. Questions, comments on any or all of that. Let me see if I can grab a pen here so I can take my own notes. Oh, here we go. Yes. So let us start with that. I'm going to be looking for hands, either icons from your reaction button in the bottom dock will raise your hand, and then you have to push it again to take your hand down, or just raise your hand. And I will see what we've got here. And I don't see any hands so far. Bobby, do you? Oh, I see Patty.
Yes,
Okay, Patty
and Karen.
Patty can unmute, and then Karen.
Well, truthfully, I was surprised at the entire business about a life beyond life. I didn't know that was really part of our Jewish religion. So that was a big surprise to me.
Yeah, kind of mind-blowing, some of it, I think. Thank you, Patty. Karen, and then Diane.
Yeah, first I had a question. Is this still from Simcha Raphael's book?
Yes,
Okay.
all of the reading except for, well, the first assignment was an overview of Jewish civilizations, actually from Wikipedia. That's very well done. And then the other assignments were all from Simcha Raphael's book, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. Very comprehensive book. Yes.
Okay,
For those of you who don't know, Simcha Raphael is the husband, also a rabbi, of Rabbi Gila Razel Raphael, who was rabbi of Lev Ha'ir, heart of the city, for a stint before my time. So this is all in the family. Karen.
yes, so in sort of buried in the middle of this portion that we read, was this quote from the Berachot, that says, when you pray, know before whom you stand, which I don't know if anybody recognized that, but
Yes, I do.
yeah, is it from the Y or from the Ethical
Yes.
Society? The Y?
I think that was what was the big message on over the stage at the Y, right?
It was, I'm pretty sure it was at the Y. And I used to look at that every time, and I found it an intriguing quote that I had never heard before, you know.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then the rest of that sentence says, "Know when you pray, know before whom you stand," which was like etched in front of the stage at the Y. And in that account, you will be worthy of the life of the world to come. So
interesting. Yeah.
I just was, you know, it just was a familiar thing that had always intrigued me whenever we were there.
Beautiful. And for anyone who hasn't been there, the Gershman Y used to be our congregation's home before we were in the Ethical Society building. And since that was literally carved above, it was in the lintel above the stage.
Yeah.
It's probably still there. I mean, I know they've done through various renovations, but you could go see it, what Karen's speaking to, which is a quote that was also mentioned in today's meeting.
Is it a Jewish quote or a Christian? I mean, is it from the Torah somewhere?
It's biblical from somewhere. Maybe it says up there. I don't remember there being a reference to it, but
I mean, in the reading, never knew where it was from, but in the reading, it quoted Berachot, which I don't know what that is.
well, that would be Talmudic.
Rabbis or
That would be
something.
Talmudic, so rabbinic, yes.
It's
That would be-
rabbinic. It's
that would be the
Jewish.
Talmud,
Yeah.
but That's interesting, because that
And for
wasn't,
And for the benefit of those of you who aren't from Philadelphia or in Philadelphia, when we refer to the Y, that's the Gershman Y, which started as a Jewish Y.
yeah, that was a Jewish building, so any quote there would be from some Jewish sacred text, and it sounds like you found out it's a Talmudic text. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting. Any
Diane
other-
had her hand up, but now
Yes,
I see it
Diane.
down.
Is Diane there?
I am here. I think you partly answered my question, which was the source of the material from which, yes, the material, where did it come from? And I have that now. I found it to be very arcane and hard to kind of fully absorb. It was, and also, I just didn't know who was the audience for that book. And I guess we are, but I just was curious if there was some insight into who uses that book. Just do the Reconstructing Judaism, does the college use it, for example?
Yeah, it would be a resource basically that culls primary texts on these themes. And we're going to make more sense of it in class today. That's why there's the reading and then this discussion, because you're right. It's kind of confusing just to read some of those texts that are related to these issues we're talking about, but we're going to make more sense of it here. But let me just see if there's any other comments, hands before I move on here. And I don't see any. Okay. So we've been talking about Judaism as an evolving religious civilization and the kind of signature, unique, creative contribution that Reconstructing Judaism seminary made to Jewish education, which was to organize all the material according to civilizational layers. And so we talked about biblical civilization, rabbinic civilization, medieval, modern, and contemporary. And when the Rabbinical College opened in 1968, for decades, that's how the curriculum was organized. But guess what? It is no longer organized that way. And I promised I would tell you the story of why there were those curriculum changes, because it's obviously the next step in Reconstructing Judaism is no longer doing that, what I thought was very brilliant contribution. It's not that there's none of it now, but the whole curriculum has been reorganized. And the question is why? So when that curriculum was created, growing out of the work of Dr. Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of what we now call Reconstructing Judaism, he called it Reconstructionism. When he created these ideas and the founders of the Rabbinical College developed these ideas and shaped a curriculum around them, it was a new concept in the world that every group of people has its own sacred teachings and practices and thinks of itself as God's chosen people. And that this Jewish idea of being chosen by God, which is very central to our historic texts, is not what we want to put front and center anymore in modern times. Instead, what we want to do is to see the Jewish community as part of a human community, a global human community. And we want to learn about the cross-cultural experiences and teachings and ideas and the influences, the mutual influences. And so when you're creating a civilizational lens, what you're looking for is like, how was Jewish culture shaped by how was Jewish culture shaped by Greek civilization or by Muslim civilization? You're looking at the intersections, the interactions, And you're looking at us as a global community that decenters that idea of chosenness, that we're the one and only people that matter. That was a new idea in the early 1920s when Dr. Mordechai Kaplan was writing. And you know that Reconstructing Judaism edits some of the prayers and takes out that idea of chosenness. And this curriculum was designed, this evolving Jewish civilization curriculum was designed to help explore how Judaism is part of world civilizations. So that's a very big, radical, new, different idea than how Judaism had ever been done before. And it was amazing for those decades. Like I said, classes ago, prior to that, the way Jewish teaching had always been organized was you would delve into the sacred texts and you'd learn Hebrew and Aramaic and Rashi's script. Rashi's comments are written in a special script. You have to specially learn a different script, alphabet, to read Rashi. You'd learn all that stuff and you'd study the commentaries and the codes, all the Jewish sacred texts. So the civilizational approach was a move away from studying just Jewish sacred texts. Instead, it was a move towards studying the intersections between all the different peoples that make up a world. So why did that change? Why isn't that still relevant? Well, it is still relevant. But what changed was that as the Jewish community becomes more and more assimilated into American civilization, Jewish people aren't getting the same kind of depth education in being able to wrestle with our own Jewish tradition. And so rabbinical student seekers were coming to the college saying, we actually need to learn more about Judaism. Like, forget all this cross-cultural, interesting, intersectional. We don't even know how to read Hebrew. Like, we don't know what the Talmud is. Like, teach us Judaism. And so the students were coming much more hungry for a deep dive into Judaism. And not only that, the teaching community was realizing, wow, these people don't know the beginning thing. Like, what is Shabbat? I mean, this is pretty essential. You're going to be a Jewish leader, but they don't even have a depth experience of their own sacred cycle of the year or how to access texts or whatever. So now the curriculum has been reorganized. So interesting, much more in line with that original way of doing it, which had to do with text skills, language skills, interpretation skills, but within the Jewish lane. And so now in the Rabbinical College, this is RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College right outside Philadelphia, the one and only Reconstructing Jewish seminary in the world. Now the curriculum focuses a lot on Torah, Talmud, responsa, codes, all these kind of very traditional, midrash, all the kind of traditional Jewish texts. And the students, believe it or not, they have to do 4 hours of text study in Chevruta per class outside of the class. So if they have a 2-hour class session, for every 2-hour class session, they have to do 4 hours in their Chevruta partnerships to study those texts and commentaries and everything. So it's like a complete shift away from what was done during those civilizational focused years. The one thing that has happened also that's different is when we were doing the civilizational approach back then, something that didn't happen in that curriculum was nobody in the college that was trying to produce rabbis to thrive in the modern age, nobody learned how to survive in systems. They didn't know how to work with boards. They didn't know how to do counseling in complex situations of family dynamics. They didn't know how to organize a denomination around some justice issue. They didn't learn anything about surviving with systems. And so what was happening was rabbis were getting out into the world and just being eaten alive by just kind of relational dynamics and crises, and they didn't know how to handle them. So the Rabbinical College also, in its revamp, added in much more teaching about how to be a leader, how to actually be a leader, not just a scholar. because those are kind of different skills. How are you going to lead, communities, whether you might be leading a Hillel, or you might be leading a congregation, or you might be leading a social justice organization, but you're going to be leading in some organizational setting. You should know something about how to lead in an organization. That kind of teaching was added in. And in fact, I do a lot of that teaching at the Rabbinical College, because that's something I've studied and trained in. So I do a lot of that teaching, and they get that now. And the other thing that got added in was, during that civilizational approach, there was no concept of the students themselves in formation for a spiritual life. They were going to step out into the world and be spiritual leaders, but nobody was kind of guiding them and training them in their own spiritual development. And so that shifted also. And that now there is a lot of kind of attention to the students' spiritual life. Like, they all get spiritual directors. And some of you who are in our own spirituality group here that was started many, many years ago have had some of that, a taste of that experience. But they get that opportunity. They get a lot of attention to the development of their own inner life in relation to leadership. And that includes things like having good boundaries around sexual decisions, like to stop sexual abuse. They get trained in how to not enter abusive, relationships that would, or even situations that might lead to that. Like, you can't date somebody who's your congregant type of thing. They get trained in all those kinds of things. So in the new curriculum, not only did it go back to the old way of doing text, but what was added in was much more attention to organizational dynamics and to formation spiritually of rabbinic leaders. And I see in the chat box, Ed is wondering, in a direct message to me, he's wondering if the Chevruta relationships and study are new in RRC, the Rabbinical College, as part of a change in the curriculum, or if Chevruta relationships preceded the change. And the answer to that is, back then, when I was a student, we would be in Chevrutas for text classes, but there just weren't that many text classes in the balance of things. So like, I had a Chevruta for my Mishnah class, for my Talmud class. As the curriculum went on, you did have Chevruta every year. In fact, I had the same Chevruta partner for 5 years, who's a beloved of mine today, a rabbi friend, because you kind of really bond with your Chevruta partner, as any of you have ever been in Chevruta before. I have a Chevruta now. I've been with my partner for 20 years, and we do a weekly study session, my current one. And it's a very special part of a life, is to have that learning landing place. But yeah, so we did have Chevruta back then, but we didn't have nearly as much. They have way, way, way more than that now, because they have so many more text classes. And that's the traditional way of learning text, is you work it through with a study buddy. Your Chevruta partner is a dyad, and you meet regularly, and you kind of just dive in and you do the best you can. I remember once spending 3 hours with my Chevruta partner on a Talmud text, trying to understand the word that turns out it meant fly, as in the noun of the bug flying around, a fly, but we thought it was a verb. So we were going through all of our possible lists of analysis. We could not understand it. 3 hours on that one word. And that's what Chevruta does. It just, you and your partner try to get what's going on in this text on the level of like the literal grammar, on the level of the meaning, on the level of the spiritual teaching, everything. So I told you I would tell you what has happened at RRC since this civilizational curriculum. Let me just see if there's any comments or questions about that. And I see Enid. You can unmute, Enid. Enid, you're still muted. Wait, Enid, you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself? Here. All right, Enid, we're going to come back to you when you get unmuted. Phyllis is wondering in the chat box, why is there only one RRC in the world? Well, good question. There has to be kind of a balance between the amount of places there are to service as a rabbi and the number of rabbis you produce as a movement. So, we're a relatively small but potent movement as things go. Many Reconstructing Judaism ideas have been absorbed into the Reform and conservative movements, and even have influenced the Orthodox world. So it's been a very potent but small, mighty power. But we're not big in the grand scheme of things. Paul, you can unmute.
I think you just answered my question, but because I wonder if they took away what made maybe RRC unique, or the whole seminary training, does it lend itself more to Reform, conservative, and maybe Orthodox? I heard you say a little bit of that, because do they really observe each other in terms of the seminary and the training, that makes each one a little more similar in terms of making sure Judaism is at the forefront? Does that make sense what I'm asking? Because otherwise,
Really interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, in some respects, these curriculum changes drew our movement closer to other traditional movements, but there are other sort of socio-political reasons that RRC is pretty unique. RRC's been at the leading edge of accepting gay, lesbian, the whole thing, TQ, ... full range of leadership, and unleashed an enormous power of creativity and leadership into the Jewish world, which was followed by the Reform and very slowly, reluctantly, the conservative movement. So RRC on the and that also another way that RRC has been on the leading edge was after huge controversy and a big wrestle, as these things do tend to be. It's true on the LGBT one too, but we're ahead of the curve doing that wrestle, is that RRC has been on the leading edge of just accepting interfaith, all the diversity of real Jewish family life today, and producing leaders who can meet the moment in this world. And one of the big issues in recent times was whether rabbinical students can have non-Jewish partners. And RRC is the only one of the movements in which the rabbinical student is allowed to have a non-Jewish partner, even though they're ministering to whole communities where everybody has non-Jewish partners. And the world was ahead of the seminary, because the world was saying, we don't want a rabbi who doesn't think that non-Jewish partners are completely equal. And so the seminaries were late to catch up, but RRC was the first of them. And it's still the only one, I believe, that has that policy. And right before that policy was wrestled through and decided on, it used to be that you couldn't come into the rabbinical college with a non-Jewish partner, and you couldn't graduate. But in between, you could have a non-Jewish partner, because nobody was really checking or had any way to monitor it. And that's a mess. That's a total mess. It meant people had to live in hiding or divorce their partners before they started rabbinical school. It's pathetic. And they corrected that. And it's leading the way for the world in many ways, because that's what life looks like for the Jewish people. And so, anyway, good questions are coming. Okay, Enid, we're back to you, and you are unmuted, so just speak now.
But I get confused, but that's all right.
Problem.
Yeah. Okay, I'm confused in this sense.
Yeah.
When Mordecai Kaplan came up with this idea, do you mean to say that there was no traditional study of rabbinic of Judaism and texts and Talmud and Torah? I mean, that seems very basic.
You mean in Mordecai Kaplan's view?
Yeah,
of
I mean, well, I guess then we go to the seminary in terms of teaching. It would seem to me that you have to have those basics.
Oh yeah, well, Enid, there wasn't none. That was a strand of Mordecai Kaplan's vision, but he lived in a world where he literally came as an immigrant, and everybody he knew already spoke Hebrew, Yiddish, Arab, you know what I mean? Like their issue was how to learn English. Right. In his day, congregations were desperate to have a rabbi who could speak English. So he lived in a dense Jewish world. And by now, with the rate of assimilation and the current what it means to live in more than one civilization, we don't have that same kind of Jewish density or literacy in our lives in this day and age. So you have to respond with a different educational creation to meet this moment, which in and of itself is a civilizational response, right? It's saying like, we have to live in this civilizational moment. And we can't just archaically keep whatever was done for 60 years. We have to notice where we are now.
Okay, but
Bobby.
Yeah,
still we
would it
still-
also,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
would it also be fair to say that Reconstructing Judaism is leading the way globally in terms of racial diversity and acceptance?
I would say we are peers with others who are leading that. We're certainly not behind the,
Right.
you know, I should say this was a moment of awakening for white people across denominations, so including in the Jewish denominations. But yeah, RSC's really attended to that. Not just RSC, but our movement, our whole movement, yes, and alongside a lot of other places that have been waking up at the same time. And Karen's asking, did they go back to the chosen people concept? No, the chosen people, that was once and all, that is not a reconstructing Jewish idea. We do not believe we were selected out as better than any other people. So that was a contribution that has really been sustained. Although not every little language change has, you know, like I feel like even we can barely remember that sentence in our long Kiddush prayer where we substitute, we are the chosen people from, we substitute to God has brought us close to God's work, and none of us can even remember it without looking at the text. So I would say that's a failed edit of the Reconstructing Jewish movement. I mean, Ed's laughing. I mean, do you think so, Ed? Would you say that's a failed edit? I mean, we can, but I think we have made that change in some other places that work better.
I try to explain, Julie, why I respond to Judaism. I try to explain that to my Catholic raised partners, Suzanne. And what I had and she didn't was this richness at home. And it's singing at table with my parents on Friday night. Kivonu v'charta. You know, that's why it's an ineffective edit for me, because of this childhood memory.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Well, the key word here is evolving. And that's exactly what we're looking at right now. How do you evolve something in effective ways? So sometimes a change is offered that just doesn't quite work because either it's not rooted enough in the past or people can't remember it or whatever. But other times a change is offered that's just kind of spreads like wildfire, and it's the renewal of an old tradition. And Enid's asking the question we always have to ask, you know, how far can we go with changes and still have it be Jewish? But on the other hand, if we don't make some changes, you're not going to end up with anything Jewish because people flock away from it because it doesn't make sense and it doesn't speak to the moment. So those are exactly our questions here.
If I could add something
Sure.
to that, and that's what makes, in my mind, that's what makes Reconstructionism special. Because we're not told what to believe or what to think. While the movement has certain positions as a movement, people are given the freedom to deviate from that position without, in the broad sense, without criticism.
That is the beautiful thing. And I think that is exactly it, is that the Reconstructing Judaism looks at the mechanism of evolution. It names it and it invites you to participate in it. And just as a little example of that you all have experienced, when we call people up for an Aliyah prayer, Reconstructing Judaism changes one sentence in the traditional Aliyah prayer. We change the sentence that means God chose us from all other people. And instead, in our Reconstructing Judaism Sidur, we have the sentence, God brought us, I think, which sentence do we put in there? Is that the one about God brought us close to God's work? I think that's what's substituted there. But we always, when we're doing that, we invite people to use whatever language they're comfortable with. Like they may have been trained in a tradition where it's just like rolls off their lips and they're very comfortable with the chosen people language. And we're not going to cut them off from that heritage, like Ed's speaking of, from their childhoods or whatever. But on the other hand, we're going to invite people into something that speaks more to the actual theology that we're trying to express there. Debbie.
Hi. So to me, the difference between spirituality and some religions, some systems, is in spirituality, you're always looking for the answers, whether within or as a group. So I think it's beautiful that this is a movement that continues to examine. To me, that is spirituality.
That's great, Debbie. It's basically a religion that incorporates a lot of spirituality in this case, right? Because we have all the structures of a denomination and a congregation. And within that, we've got a lot of questing and spiritual seeking and wrestling, really. Right. And I think that's Phil there. Okay, Phil. And then we're going to move on.
Okay, thank you. I just appreciate, as a person who was not raised Jewish, the prayer book has both the traditional and the modern interpretive form of each thing so that you can see both and take what you want from both of them. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And there are other changes that some people like to do a lot of the prayers in feminine Hebrew because it's such a gendered language. So that's a different change. There's whole prayer books created in feminine or gender neutral language. So there's like many ways that people are wrestling with what we're, the inheritance and then carrying it in a meaningful way into the future. Etta, okay, you will be our last person here. But you need to unmute, Etta.
I always felt being the chosen people was not what we were accused of being prideful, only chosen to have a greater responsibility. That's how I always.
That's one of the interpretations. Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of midrash about how God offered to everyone the Torah, but only the Jews would step up and take it. So, I guess that's a little bit of a defensive interpretation of the chosenness. But anyway.
But that's always been an accusation that has been thrown at people. And when people have said that to me, oh, you think you're chosen? I said, only chosen to have a greater responsibility.
Yep, that is an interpretation. Okay, folks, I'm going to summarize some of the themes from the last 3 weeks, and we're eventually going to go into small groups for an activity. So I just want to review that one of the things we've learned is that in these last thousands of years, there has been a collage of themes around this these ideas. Well, but let me just backtrack for a minute. We chose a topic to track through the civilizations, the idea of what happens after you die. How is that changed in each of the civilizations? So we can see these evolving Jewish ideas. And throughout this exploration, there's been the truth that actually this is a decentralized tradition. So there's no one pope who's going to tell you what your catechism is. And therefore, there is a diversity of ideas through space and time. It's not a clear-cut civilizational, this bucket, this bucket, this bucket. Because in different places, people had different ideas at different historical times. Ideas coexisted. They weren't always logically organized into one final position, because that's not how Judaism works. And so many times there was sort of ambiguous teachings about life after death. Like you could have kind of almost contradictory ideas coexisting, because in Judaism, we weren't trying to have one kind of position paper or like final, what do they call it? Is that the catechism? The catechism is how you teach children in Catholicism, I guess. But we're not trying to have like papal edicts or something that like lay out the law in these ways. So we have many different positions. Now, what makes them Jewish is that they are rooted in the past, pointing towards the future. And Enid, this is an answer to your question about continuity and change. What makes these different evolving themes Jewish is that they're rooted in the Jewish past, in language and text and Jewish experience, in a way that points towards the future. So in a way, if I was going to come up with one sentence about how do we do this evolving Jewish civilization, that's what I would say. We root it in the past, we point towards the future. And that leads us to our moment, right? Where what's the connection between the past and the future? It's us. So that's kind of like, I hope what people are taking away from this series is that how do we evolve Judaism and how do we participate in an evolving Jewish civilization? We root it in the past and we point towards the future. So that's Mordechai Kaplan's idea that tradition has a vote, but not a veto. Big Reconstructing Judaism famous quote. Tradition has a vote, but not a veto. We're leading the way into the future. So I just wanted to reinforce that over these thousands of years, it's a decentralized tradition. There are many coexisting diverse ideas. It's kind of ambiguous, but you can actually trace through the civilizations some kind of general ideas. And in going back to biblical civilization, we talked about the idea of Sheol as an actual shadowy realm in the earth. So like something about like, where do people go after death? Well, kind of into the earth. Now, what does that mean? Like now we might think about that as DNA, as like you're going to become a flower, you know, the sort of recycling of the minerals in our bodies. Who knows? I'm going to ask you in a few minutes. But also in biblical times, we had the quote I shared with you from Jacob. He was dying and he says, I'm going to be gathered to my kin. Remember that? And we asked, what does that mean, to be gathered to your kin? He wanted a burial place in a family cave. And we talked about, do you think you need to have your body in the land to go back to your kin? How else could you maybe understand being gathered into your kin? So that's all biblical. In the rabbinic era, we get the idea of the resurrection of the dead. And then we get questions about, well, is that an individual resurrection that you, Paul, are going to come back to life? You, Iris Newman, are going to be resurrected? Or could it be a collective resurrection where kind of the Jewish people have continuity and live? Am Yisrael Chai, that idea. Could there be a collective continuity there? And we looked at the question of Machaye Metim, which is the sentence or the phrase in our Amidah prayer that some denominations change, which means re-enliven the dead, the Metim. What does that mean? Does it mean physically bring them back to be their body and their bones? Or could there be a spiritual breathing life into what feels dead? Like maybe you're kind of suffering from pandemic fatigue. Could spiritual renewal breathe life into that dead place in you? Could there be a spiritual renewal that is Mechaye Metim? Or does it really mean it's taking bodies after death and putting them back into flesh and bones? You know, that was the rabbinic period. And what we just read for this week was looking at the medieval period. It was looking at the Kabbalistic idea of reincarnation called Gilgul. And believe it or not, reincarnation is a very Jewish concept. Who knew that? How many people knew reincarnation was a Jewish concept? I see a few hands, but yeah, so some people are shocked by that because we don't really study medieval Judaism that much, but there are lots and lots and lots of teachings about Jewish reincarnation. And that is where we get the idea that we do speak of today about the journey of the soul. So I'm going to be asking you in your small groups, is the journey of the soul, okay, what does that really mean? It could be like a kind of psychological opportunity to grow, you know, in cultivating the virtues of a human being, like kindness. You could get better at kindness through the iterations. Or it could mean an ethical elevation, like you're going to get better at doing good deeds in life after life after life. Or what else could it mean? And one of the things when we talk about Jewish continuity and change is that we get to take from all of the earlier civilizations. This is the gift of understanding Judaism civilizationally, is we are the beneficiaries of all of these ideas throughout the ages to weave into how we want to approach this moment today and live into our Jewish future. So we get to look at the biblical, rabbinic, medieval periods and draw from them in crafting something meaningful to us today. But we do have to root what we think today in that past for it to be Jewish. We can't just invent something out of whole cloth and say, oh, wow, I think we should do the doobie-dobby practice of just like namba baba booba. It has to be rooted in Jewish language, values, text, experience, stories, anywhere for us to take it forward. There's a language that we need to kind of speak to and a set of values. So let me stop there and see if anybody has questions or comments there before we go forward. I'm looking to see if there are any hands. And I don't see any hands. Bobby, do you see any hands? I think we're good. Okay. Well, I do want to comment on a couple other things before, and then we're going to go into our small groups. One thing that's unique about Judaism compared to some other religions in thinking about life after death is Judaism has a balance between paying attention to life in this world and life in the world to come. Olam haba, we spoke about as the world to come. Olam hazeh is this world. And whereas Christianity is very weighted towards the world to come, right? And it's not that Judaism doesn't have a lot of teachings about the world to come. They're different in different eras, but Judaism has a balance. It's not at all the weight is not on the world to come. If anything, the weight is more on this world. Do the mitzvahs now. Make it right now. Be God's partner in the work of creation. That's a big Jewish theme. Be God's partner in the ongoing work of creation. So there's a real balance between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba in Judaism. I will just share a little story with you. You might have covered it also in the reading, but this is an example of what I just said. This is a Talmudic story I'm going to share with you. That's kind of, this is so Judaism, is these little kind of nuggets of a story that teach some idea. Okay, listen to this. It's going to kind of blow you away. It's in the Talmud. Okay. You guys know King Solomon was the son of our most beloved king ever, King David. So when King David died, Solomon, his son, sent this inquiry to the body of rabbis called the Beit HaMidrash. And this is what Solomon asked. It's really weird. My father is dead and lying in the sun, and the dogs of my father's house are hungry. What shall I do? So in other words, there's animals that need care. The dogs need to be fed. The father's body is lying there in the sun. What should I do? The rabbi sent back this answer: feed the dogs first and then attend to your dead father. Living dogs take precedence over a dead king. That is just one kind of potent example of how Judaism in general attends a lot to this world. But it's not that there's nothing, there's a ton about the world to come. There's many, many stories and teachings, and it's, a lot of Jewish people think we don't have the idea of a world to come. We do have that idea deeply rooted, but we also put the weight on this world. Yeah. And just one other thing, since it was from this week's reading about the medieval period, is that in the medieval period, there was lots of visioning about what did it look like after death, this journeying. And they imagined, this Garden of Eden situation where there were like gates and fiery angels and, a journey through compartments. There were 3 outer walls and 7 rungs of righteousness. And then there was, this idea of reincarnation when you made it through all of that. And this was kind of a spiritual journey, but then it got wedded to the rabbinic idea of ethical mitzvot, that you needed to do better and better and better as you went through those rungs. And so this was their idea of Gilgul. That's the Jewish word for reincarnation. And at the end, there'd be God's reckoning. It was always kind of this idea of a reckoning, that you're moving towards this reckoning. And as you go into your small groups, I just invite you to also think about, we have the concept of a reckoning too. And like, who do you want to be in this world? What do you want on your gravestone? What do you want people to remember at your funeral about you? What is the reckoning that you want? And whether you think that's some distant thing up in some heaven at the pearly gates, or whether you could imagine that being something that happens in this world and it's a reckoning, it's something that you're journeying towards. So we're going to go into small groups now. Let's do it for 15 minutes, Bobby, of 5 people. And then we're going to come back. Well, one person in each group, wait, don't go yet though. One person in each group plan to report back. And before we go, I am going to screen share something, which I hope works out here. Let me see if I can get to this. Oh, do I have the right to screen share, Bobby? Because it doesn't seem like I do. There we go. Yeah, now I do. Okay, this is good. Oh, but wait a second. Is it showing up?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, there we go. So if we were together in person, this would be easier, but we're on Zoom. So this is a summary of and if you can actually, I don't know if there's a way for you to take this with you into your small groups. There may not be. But we reviewed the biblical ideas of Jacob saying, I will be gathered to my kin. How do you interpret being gathered to your kin? And do you think you need to be buried in the ground near your family for that to happen? From the rabbinic period, what does resurrection of the dead mean to you? How do you deal with Machaye Metim, re-enlivening the dead? And is this a physical promise or a psycho-spiritual promise? And from the medieval period, what do you make of the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgul or reincarnation? And if you believe in reincarnation in some way, what kind of a journey is this?
Julie, if you can copy that and paste it into the chat, then I think everyone will have access to it when
I'm
they're in
not
their
sure they'll
breakout
be
rooms.
able to see it after they go into their small groups, but I can certainly try that.
okay.
I'm going to try that. Give me 1 minute.
Mhm.
And your task in the small groups. Yeah, well, no, that worked for now, but I'm not sure it will show
right.
up in their small
We'll see.
groups, Bobby, but good idea. I can also try to broadcast something into the small groups. Your task in your small groups is to collectively come up with one paragraph that speaks to your contemporary view of the afterlife, but you have to root it in Jewish tradition, because that is what evolves a civilization, is we take from the past to lead to the future. We root our Judaism in the past as we create its future. So that's your task. Onward into your small groups, you'll have 15, well, maybe 12 minutes at this point. Each group come back with a paragraph speaking to what you think happens after death collectively, to the best of your ability.
Okay, so I have this set up. It's automatically going to move everybody into their rooms, but you have the option, well, you have the option to leave that room.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Okay,
Bob.
here we go.
that our bodies go into the earth and the ocean and the great beyond, and it's eternal. It never dies. So it might mean that spiritually, the Jewish people live on, even though individuals are dead. So we get to reconstruct this past that we inherit and shape its future. This has been an amazing learning adventure. I've loved being here in these Zoom rooms with each of you. And I want to end today with a healing prayer. One of our community members was diagnosed with COVID, and I especially want to direct this healing prayer to her today, and then with our Torah study prayer. And then we'll say goodbye. These are the words that were sung for Miriam in the desert. Anna elna refana la. Anna elna refana lo. Let's send our love to those who need it so. Can you hear ratzon? Anna elna refana la. Anna elna refana lo. Let's send our love to those who need it so. Can you hear ratzon? Can you hear ratzon? Can you hear ratzon? May it be so. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. I'm going to stay in the Zoom room just for a few minutes after the class ends, for anybody who wants to stay for a couple more minutes.
Hi, it's Diane. If anyone wants to know,